Okay, the paper I did was called Imperialist, Industrial, and Abolitionist Britain, unaware that the cotton that boosted industry was grown by slaves. I know it's a long title, but the essence of what I want to address here, it has to do with British imperialism and slavery. Or perhaps it would be better to say that the other way around. The horrors of slavery are things we were taught as kids, perhaps to lesser or greater degrees. I think it's important to remember the importance of slavery on many levels, particularly on a human level, and also the wrongness of slavery as an economic model. The wealth of the New World was multiplied because of the use of slaves. The Atlantic slave trade enforced an economic institution of profitability based on the overexploitation of human labor. 12 million enslaved Africans were brought as human cargoes to the Americas, of which 25% perished en route, and another 4 million died in the process of being captured. Britain's role in slavery was not unique. It was one of many European powers that were benefiting from slavery, but Britain did have a role in it, and both in exploiting in its colonies and in the slave trade itself. Slavery was extremely brutal all over the Americas, particularly in Brazil and the Caribbean, due to living conditions and treatment, or perhaps better to say, treatment and living conditions. The lifespan of slaves was very short in these areas, and the import of slaves was constant. The horrors of slavery cannot be minimized. Slaves were not treated as human beings. The treatment they suffered might be comparable with animals, and perhaps not even that. The birth of racism that came along with slavery, the justification of slavery on the superiority of whiteness. Here, Equiano's narrative of the Middle Passage and slavery in the Caribbean is very eloquent in showing some of a fraction of the abuses that we can see depicted in images and other autobiographical information on this. The cruelty of slavery was legislated. Britain legislated that whiteness had superiority over enslaved Africans. Thus, only enslaved Africans could work on plantations, and plantation owners had basically no regulations to their exploitation. The only thing they had to do was give, I think, some clothing once a year. And in terms of how they took care of the slaves or treated the slaves, there was no legislation. And cruel punishments were inflicted constantly for minimal supposed disobedience, and particularly in the search for freedom. Here I'm going to show some images from the Atlantic slave trade and slave life in the Americas, a visual record, which is a project by the Virginia Foundation for the Humanities and the Digital Media Lab at the University of Virginia Library. On the left, you can see slaves being captured. And on the right, you can see a slave ship, a British slave ship, where I guess you really can't see from here, but the people are obviously kept there like sardines, as if they were not human, which is part of the abomination of the whole process. Began with the capture through the Middle Passage and during slavery in the United States and other countries in the Americas. Here we have a slave auction in Virginia, the branding of slaves on the right by slave traders. And here we have abuse of slaves on both a whipping and a woman who's burned. Here we have instruments of torture, attacks by dogs. And I do want to point out here that despite the cruelty, enslaved people still found the courage to continue to seek freedom in different ways. The continuous drive to escape from bondage and the audacity used in doing so, and the willingness to do so despite the consequences of the courageous things that enslaved men and women did to regain the freedom they were unjustly deprived of. These examples of courage should not be forgotten. I have a couple examples seen here. On the left, we can see it's from the United States of a group of slaves who were escaping. To the right is also an image from the United States. Here are Maroon communities in Jamaica and a leader of the Maroons. Britain abolishes slavery in the early 19th century, but despite its abolitionist stance, the backbone of Britain's industrial development was slave labor. Cotton textiles led the Industrial Revolution that put Britain at the forefront as an empire. After the invention of the cotton gin in the 1790s, the production of cotton in the United States multiplied exponentially, as did the slave population used to produce it. Britain imported most of the cotton it used in its industry from the United States and knew it was produced by slave labor. Here we have some images of the cotton gin. Britain's industrial advancement was thanks to slave labor and the underdevelopment of its colonies. Britain did not allow for the development of potential competitors, for example, India. So it really put a hold on their development to precisely be able to dominate the industry. My questioning here is on the moral coherency of Britain. I think we have to understand these horrific things in order to create a different future and think about humanity on different terms. While Britain was not the only empire that used slave trade, its lack of coherency in the use of slave labor despite its abolition, despite having abolished it, is something I think is important to note and to know. And that is it. Thank you very much.